Hey guys, hope you're doing well. So today I want to delve into the Temple of Jerusalem and the symbolism and meaning behind it. So we're not going to be focusing so much on the history of it, but more on how the structure and the activities within it reflected the religious ideas that it was built upon. Okay. Now, the importance of the temple is first of all that this is the essence of the religion of Israel. Okay? The temple is to that religion what Tawheed or what the Quran is to Islam, what the divine self sacrifice on the cross is to Christianity. And so, to understand the religion of Israel, we have to understand the temple. Likewise, the theme of my channel is the evolution of religious ideas. Contrary to what is believed about Judaism, Judaism is not a static, monotheistic religion. It certainly is monotheistic now, but the ancient religion of Israel was polytheistic. There were likely concepts of a divine king, of a divine high priest. These things were removed by the Deuteronomist reformers who are monotheizing Israelites. And so there is a change in the religion, a development, an evolution. And the reason why we go over this is that so that we moderns who live in a secular world can reconnect with these ideas and hopefully we may generate a new paradigm for our time. All right. So I am not trying to restore old ideas. We are not trying to recreate the image of the church in the first century. We are rather trying to allow these ideas to reach our hearts and minds so that something anew may be generated. All right. That is the purpose here. So, with that, let us delve into the Temple of Jerusalem. And first, let's begin where the temple was built because this will elucidate much of the symbolism behind it. So, in the biblical narrative, in creation, the world is a void. There's only a primordial ocean. This is a motif in many mythical systems all over the world. And what the waters represent are the waters of chaos, a sort of destructive creativity. And from this water, order emerges. Order in the form of land. Land emerges from the water. Now, in Jewish tradition, the first piece of land that emerged is where the temple was built. Furthermore, Eden was made where that land emerged. And therefore, human beings, Adam, was made from the soil over which the temple stands. So, what this means is that the temple is the axis mundi. It is the center of the world from which all of creation is centered upon. It is where creation took place, where the Garden of Eden was. Okay, so this we're already seeing has a primordial center, a vital center in the cosmos. And the temple itself, you'll see, was a rectangular structure divided into three sections. Each section um, was a degree of sacredness. Okay, the most sacred area being this cubic structure called the debir. It was 20 cubits by 20 cubits, and within it was believed that God literally dwelt. All right, this is attested throughout the Old Testament, in particular Psalm 11, verse 4. You also see it in the prophet Habakkuk, chapter 2, verse 20. The Lord dwelt in his temple. Okay, a literal presence. Now, this eventually would be changed during the monotheizing reforms. The Lord will no longer literally dwell, but his name would dwell. Okay, but we're again unveiling the evolutionary process that took here. So, in the ancient religion of Israel, there was a distinction between the Lord, that is the God of Israel, and the God of the universe, El Elyon, God Most High. These were two separate beings. El Elyon was the superior being, Yahweh was his son. Okay. This distinction existed in the ancient religion of Israel, and during the reforms, these two beings were fused. So Yahweh was no longer the son of El, but rather Yahweh was El Elyon. Okay. But again, this might sound controversial to some of you if you're hearing this for the first time, but this is well elucidated in academia, and there's books published by this, famously by Mark Smith. Um, it is well known. Okay, the older version of Deuteronomy 32, 8 through 9, again, the older version of that verse reflects this more archaic theology. All right, it's an important distinction that will be made as this video develops. Okay, so here's a diagram of the temple. Again, rectangular structure. You have the three sections, the porch, the ulam, the hekel, which is the holy place, and then the most holy, the Holy of Holies, the Debir, the cubic structure where God, the God of Israel, literally dwelt. His presence was there in some mystical fashion. Now, the hekel, the holy place, is the representation of the earth. And the Debir is the representation of the heavens. And what separated these two was a veil. This veil was beautifully embroidered. It was enormous. If it ever became impure, it would take 300 priests to immerse it and wash it. Okay. When Jerusalem would be conquered, it was often taken as a spoil of war because of its ornate nature. Okay. Now, this veil was the representation of the boundary between heaven and earth. Okay. Just as the sky in the Bible, so to speak, acts as a curtain separating the heaven and the earth, so it is in the temple. An example of this is in Isaiah chapter 40, verse 22, where it says, quote, "It is he who sits above the circle of the earth, and its inhabitants are like grasshoppers, who stretches out the heavens like a curtain and spreads them like a tent to dwell in." Okay, so again, the temple is a reflection now of the universe. The veil separates the Debir, the heavens, from the earth, the Hekel. And now we're seeing a more significant development. So now the temple is in the axis mundi, it's in the center of the world. It's where Eden was. There's a connection to creation. And it is a microcosm of the universe itself. Now, important segue. When we're trying to understand this, we moderns have a difficulty because we have a different conception of space and time. Most people still follow a Newtonian conception of space, material objects, etc. Okay. To the ancients, what we're dealing with here, especially in the Holy of Holies, is what might be best described as the mythic realm. Okay. Now, by myth, I don't mean the pejorative that is used colloquially by us moderns, okay, as something fabricated. Rather, what we're talking about is a presence that is spaceless and eternal. Okay, so mythic events are not past events in some remote, murky beginning. Rather, they are occurring simultaneously in this very present and having an influence on us. Okay, so when the priest goes through the curtain, he is literally believed to be entering in the heavenly realm, in a place that is timeless and spaceless. He is entering into the divine He is becoming one of the divine beings, as we will elucidate. All right. It's very important and very challenging for us moderns with our biases and our preconceived notions to understand this element. Okay. Now let's go further. Let's delve further into this. So we mentioned the primordial waters, the symbols of chaos. Okay, the symbol of chaos that is reflected in mythologies all over the world. In South America, Asia, Africa, this is the symbol of chaos. Now, in addition to where creation having taken place, it is also believed that where the flood of Noah receded, is where the temple was built. And when those waters receded, they were capped by a foundation stone. This foundation stone is where the Debir, the Holy of Holies, was built upon. But today, because the temple was destroyed, it is currently housed under Islam's second holiest site, the Dome of the Rock. All right. Now, this points to certain possible connections between the ancient religion of Israel and the origins of Islam, which itself are murky and somewhat nebulous. All right. The, the primary holy site of Islam is in Mecca, where there is the Kaaba, that black cubic structure. Okay. It's actually not a perfect cube, but it's called a cube. Now we're also mentioning a cubic structure in the Temple of Jerusalem. We're seeing how Muslims, when they conquered the region, they built a structure where the Holy of Holies once stood. So there's a possible connection here, but something worth investigating that I cannot currently delve into right now. Okay. But again, so just to tie this all in again, what we're seeing is that the temple is in the center of the world, has a connection to creation. It reflects, it is an embodiment of the universe itself. And now it is also suppressing the forces of chaos. Okay. Underneath it, the chaotic primeval waters are suppressed. All right. So what we're seeing is that the temple has a connection to what might be called the cosmic order. All right. Different religious systems have different names for this. It could be Dharma. It could be Rita, as in Hinduism, the cosmic order. In Taoism, there's certain concepts of this with the Tao. It is a vital component to the ancient religion of Israel. All right. Now we have mention of this. For example, in Isaiah chapter 24, verses 4 through 6, quote, "The earth dries up and withers, the world languishes and withers, the heavens languish with the earth. The earth is defiled by its people. They have disobeyed the laws, violated the statutes, and broken the everlasting covenant. Therefore, a curse consumes the earth. Its people must bear their guilt. Therefore, earth's inhabitants are burned up, and very few are left." Okay. Breaking the cosmic order leads to disturbances in the created order. All right. An example of this is in the prophet Haggai, chapter 1, verses 9 through 11. When the people neglected the house of the Lord, the temple, and instead focused on their own houses, this led to famine and defilement in the land. Okay. The temple is connected to cosmic order and it cannot be neglected. What this points to is that the actions within the temple are paramount. They're vital. They are necessary. They are not superfluous. They're not extra actions. They just happen to be done. They have to be done precisely. The men involved have to be pure, chaste. They must be living upright lives. There's imbued with sacredness and importance here. Okay. So what is that cosmic order and how was it sustained? It was sustained by the ritual of sacrifice. Again, to us moderns in the secular West, this is a very remote practice. It's hard for us to understand how killing an animal can be connected with cosmic order, for example. Okay. However, we do know that this is a very archaic practice by human beings. There are cave paintings dated to some 30,000 years ago that are potential depictions of sacrifice. Right? So this is very early in the human consciousness, in the human psyche, this concept of having to offer up and restore a cosmic balance, which again seems counterintuitive to us moderns, why a person would, in a time of survival, like the times of prehistory, why, let's say, animal flesh would be wasted in an offering rather than being consumed and obtaining nourishment. But this is how vital this is, and this is how archaic this principle is. All right? It stems far back into human history. Now, according to the Bible, in Leviticus chapter 17, verse 4, the life of every creature is in the blood, and this is why the Lord requires sacrifice. So the sacrifice, according to the ancient Israelites, was not a death offering. It was a life offering. Right? The life of the animal was brought forth. And what was the purpose? Because the life of the animal, according to Leviticus chapter 1, verse 4, was offered as an atonement. As an atonement. Now, what's interesting is that this atonement was more complex than how we view it, even how some modern Christians view it. Because in Leviticus chapter 16, verses 17 through 18, the atonement was not just for human beings, but for objects and places. So in this passage, the altar of the Lord is also atoned, right? So what this means is that the rituals are not just restoring and atoning human beings, but the created world is being restored and renewed. Now, what this is presupposing is that there is a certain connection between the earth and the heavens. As above, so below. As below, so above. The earthly realm where we exist, the phenomenological world, the world of experience, is a imperfect reflection of the heavenly reality. Okay? It is perpetually imperfect, and periodically it must be readjusted to realign itself with the heavenly reality. Okay? That is the meaning and the purpose behind the temple. Temple as a microcosm of the heaven and the earth, as the center point of all creation, as where the created order is sustained and preserved. Okay. Now let's delve a little bit further, because if this is true, if the temple in some sense is a reflection of the heavenly order, what that means is that the priests, who are the only people permitted into the sacred area, are in fact reflecting angels. They are the Elim, the divine beings of heaven that preserve and maintain the universe. And if that's what the priests are, then we must ask ourselves, who is the high priest? The high priest reflects the embodiment of the Lord. Okay, this is, again, going to sound controversial. He is the man God, or becomes the man God, becomes the embodiment of Yahweh, transposing himself from the earthly Hekel into the heavenly Debir. And this is reflected in the changing of vestments, which is recorded in the Bible, because in the Bible reflects the high priest, who is the only man permitted to enter the Holy of Holies one time a year, changes his vestments. Now, why do they change his vestments? Well, we have some attestations from Jewish authors. Let's look at Josephus, who I don't think needs any explanation who he was. In his Antiquities, chapter 3, subsection 184, he says, quote, The high priest's tunic likewise signifies the earth, being of linen, and its blue the arch of heaven, while it recalls the lightnings by the pomegranates, the thunder by the sound of the bells. His upper garment too denotes universal nature, which it pleased God to make of 4 elements, being further interwoven with gold in token. All right, so what this means is that when the priest is in the hekel, okay, that is, you can call the antechamber, the sphere or the area uh, proximate to but before the Holy of Holies, he is dressed to represent the universe, where you function in the hekel, the earth. But when he passes through the veil into the Holy of Holies, which is heaven, he wore linen garments. Now, why would he wear linen? Well, the reason is that in the Bible, it attests to the fact that heavenly beings, angels, are dressed in white. Okay? For example, in Ezekiel chapter 9, verse 2, Ezekiel sees a man clothed in linen. Men in white garments, are how the angels, the divine beings of heaven, manifest. Okay? So what is this image implying? As the priest crosses the temple, as he crosses the veil, he is becoming a divine being. Okay? He is transforming. It's the symbolic representation of the ascent of a human from created to divine order. That is the representation. When the priest is in the debut, in the Holy of Holies, he no longer represents the created world, but is deemed one of the heavenly entourage. The white linen garment was the dress of the angels, given to favored human beings upon their ascent to heaven. Okay. This is the representation. Right? This is the original meaning of this, why this is occurring. All right. And conversely, when the Lord would proceed from his presence through the veil, he would materialize. He would take on the 4 elements and manifest on earth as a theophany. All right? So the veil is a central symbol of the world, of the materialization of things, or the dematerialization, the boundary. All right? It is, according to Dr. Margaret Barker, in The Gate of Heaven, which is a source for this video, perhaps one of the earliest conceptions of the concept of the incarnation. The idea that the invisible Lord can materialize on earth. Okay. Now, let's develop this further, because undoubtedly the idea of a man-god priest, high priest, is probably controversial. So what is the basis for this? Okay. We have some more support from the Jewish thinker Philo. Now, Philo is very important because he was a Jewish thinker living in Alexandria in the time of Jesus. Okay, he is contemporaneous to Jesus. Right? When Jesus walked the earth, Philo was alive and he was writing. So he gives us an insight into Second Temple Judaism prior to the destruction of the temple in 70 AD. Right? He has many interesting things to say. Okay, although many people who don't like what he has to say discount him as a Hellenist. I personally agree with the group of scholars who say that Philo was preserving ancient Jewish wisdom that he presented in Greek images. I think this is correct. I think he's obviously, the things he is saying is obviously reflecting archaic Jewish theology, okay, prior to the reforms, prior to the Deuteronomic reforms. Okay, so what does he say? So Philo, astoundingly, in his book Questions on Genesis, chapter 2, subsection 62, speaks of what he refers to in Greek as a deuteros deus, a, quote, second God. And he makes a distinction between God Most High and the second God, who is his logos. And he says that human beings were made in the image not of the God of the universe, which is impossible because he is beyond all things, but in the image of the second God, in the image of the Logos, in the image of Yahweh. Right? This is astounding if you're hearing this for the first time, because again, the conception most people have mistakenly is that Judaism was always monotheistic, it's always been static. This is not true. All right? The theology of Israel was far more complex. All right. Nowadays, it pretty much reflects the theology of the reformers, but in the past, the situation was far more complicated. Now, furthermore, Philo says that this second God, this Logos, is the heavenly high priest. Okay, so now we have a high priest on earth in the temple. We have now a high priest in heaven. Okay, and so he speaks of two temples, a heavenly temple and an earthly temple. The earthly temple is the imperfect reflection of the heavenly temple. Okay? Therefore, the high priest is an embodiment of the second God. He is an embodiment of Yahweh. So we read from Dr. Margaret Barker's book, since the true high priest was a heavenly figure, he was the Logos, the second God, he originally passed through the veil, not to, but from the presence of God. As he passed through the veil, so he took form from it, and thus became visible, robed in the four elements of the created order. Now the garments that the supreme Logos of him that is puts on a raiment are the world. For he arrays himself in earth and air and water and fire, and all that comes from these. Okay, so therefore, the earthly high priest was thus the second God in his earthly manifestation, who passed back into the presence of God as the mediator. Now, these references, anyone familiar with the New Testament will ring a bell, because these same elements are referred to of Jesus as the mediator, the heavenly high priest. Okay, this is all connected. Christianity, the early Christians, the first generation of Christians who were Jews, were not appropriating Greek paganism or Hellenism. They are continuing the ancient theology of Israel. All right, this is a very important distinction, because this is a common polemic against Christianity, that is an adoption of paganism. It is not. This is a continuation of archaic theology. Okay, so this is what we're seeing here. The high priest as an embodiment of the Lord, somehow mystically connected to the Lord. All right. We can go further, but again, time is short, so we must continue. Now, when the high priest, crosses the veil, where does he go? We said the debut, the Holy of Holies. So this is one depiction of the Holy of Holies without the veil. And this is from the perspective of the Hekel. And if you can look closely into the video, you'll see that there are depictions of trees within the Hekel. And again, this is a reference to the fact that the temple is a symbolic representation of the Garden of Eden. Okay. Now, when we look into the Holy of Holies, what do we see? Well, we see two gigantic cherubim, right? Two monstrous angel statues that were in the first temple, the alleged Temple of Solomon, but were then removed. And I think we'll see why it was removed. So what is the significance of these two angels? So Philo, again, speaking of these, if I can find a reference to the two angels. Let me see, where did I have the two angels here? Okay, so Philo, writing in his book on the cherubim, chapter 27, 8. He says, quote, "While God is indeed one, his highest and chief powers are two, goodness and sovereignty. And in the midst between the two is a third which unites them, the Logos. For it is through the Logos that God is both ruler and good. Of these two powers, sovereignty and goodness, the cherubim are the symbols, as the fiery sword is the symbol of reason. Now, another place, Philo refers to these two angels. He says that they are the representations of the two names of God mentioned in the Bible: Yahweh, the Lord, and Elohim. So this is one of the implications, is that this may be a proto-trinity. You have the Logos, which unifies the two other aspects of God, Yahweh and Elohim, or goodness and sovereignty. I'm not saying that this is identical to the Catholic dogma of the Trinity, which itself is a doctrine that evolved over centuries, but rather that the foundation, the concept of this, is not to be found in paganism or Hellenism. It is found in Judaism, in the archaic theology of Israel. Okay, so now we can understand why these statues would have been removed by the reformers. Obviously problematic if you have a certain conception of monotheism. Lastly, let us look at the menorah, which is obviously a very famous symbol of Judaism, even contemporary Judaism, and its meaning. Now, curiously, although undoubtedly there was a menorah in the temple, there is a silence about it in the books of history. First and Second Kings, as well as Chronicles, does not mention the menorah. And we may again uncover why that is. So it is mentioned according to some of the prophets, and in particular the prophet Zechariah. In Zechariah chapter 4 verse 10, the prophet has a vision which turns out to be the menorah. And he asks the angel who is supervising him, what is the meaning of the vision? And the angel explains to him that the 7 lights of the menorah are the 7 eyes of Yahweh. So what this implies is that in some sense, Yahweh, the Lord, is the lamp, is the menorah. And we have some curious confirmations of this, albeit indirect, as for example in 2 Samuel chapter 22 verse 29, where the Lord is described as a lamp. All right. Some can argue that's metaphorical, but perhaps we can go a bit further. Now, going back to our friend Philo, Philo says that the central stem, the center staff of the menorah, reflects the Logos. Okay, it reflects the Logos. So this seems to confirm what Zechariah was implying, that this is a representation of the Lord of Israel. Now, what does this say? Well, if the Logos is the central stem, and we obviously have branches, well, what this is a portrayal is divine plurality. The Lord of Israel is a multifaceted Lord. Okay, there's multiplicity, right? Distinctions within the Lord. This was suppressed during the Reform. All right, famously in Deuteronomy chapter 6 verse 4, Yahweh our Elohim, Yahweh our God is one Yahweh. They rejected this. And now we can understand perhaps why this famous symbol is not mentioned in the books of history, but is attested to in the prophets. And what's more interesting is that Christians in the early church continued this symbolism. So, for example, the author of Revelation in chapter 1, verses 12 through 13, identifies the center stem as the Son of Man. In other words, as Jesus. So now picture this. We have Zechariah identifying the menorah as Yahweh. We have Philo confirming this as the Logos being the center stem of the menorah. And then finally, the author of Revelation is identifying this as the Son of Man, as Jesus. Okay. The implications are obvious. Yahweh is Jesus. Okay. Jesus is not the God of the universe. He is the incarnate Son of God, Yahweh. Okay. Christians were not meddling with paganism. They were not appropriating Greek thinking, although this did happen. But the New Testament authors are continuing in the ancient theology of Israel. All right, so with that, my friends, I'll have to stop here because this has been going on long enough, but I hope you can see now the vital importance of the temple in terms of its meaning and symbolism, it being the center of the world, it being a microcosm and reflection of a heavenly reality, it having deep concepts regarding space and time that, although not consistent with the Newtonian worldview, might be more consistent with the quantum worldview. Okay, if we can even dare to speculate that far. But it also plays an integral part in Christian origins and possibly the origins of Islam. I wish you all well. Take care.